Teşekkürler. O zaman şimdi üçüncü konuşmamıza gelelim ve sonra tartışalım bu konuşmayı. Üçüncü konuşmacımız, our third speaker is Professor Erol Köroğlu. We know each other for a long time. Hello, Erol. Merhaba. We know each other from Boğaziçi University, where you are a professor now for modern Turkish literature. Erol Köroğlu calls his field of work literary cultural history of the 19th and 20th centuries Turkish literature. He taught also at Koç and Sabancı University, but then he returned to Boğaziçi University, and which is really the Türk Dili ve Edebiyatı bölümü there is particularly nice department for Turkish literature. Erol's dissertation was both published in Turkish and English. In Turkish under the title Türk Edebiyatı ve Birinci Dünya Savaşı, Propagandadan Milli Kimlik İnşasına in 2004. And this was then translated and published in English as Ottoman Propaganda and Turkish Identity, Turkish Literature during World War I in 2007. This dissertation got also an award of the History Foundation in Turkey in 2004. Erol is really also an ideal speaker for our conference, and so I leave the floor for you now, Erol. Thank you for participating. And yes, let's start with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Berthe. You're very kind. I greet you all from a sunny Istanbul, and I'll start my talk now for 20 minutes, I hope, maybe 22 minutes, we'll see. World War I started in Europe in August 1914. The Ottoman Empire entered the war on November the 3rd, 1914, and came out on October the 13th, 1918, with the tremendous defeat of the Armistice of Mudros. This 4-year war was a real disaster and a period of irreversible transformation for the Ottoman geography and the peoples living in this geography. More damage was done on the home front than on the war fronts. Deportations, forced migrations, and massacres, and the economic destruction caused by hunger, poverty, and deprivation that came with them. We cannot expect such a 4-year agony to end as soon as the war ends in the historical and collective memory. In fact, in the field of Turkish literature, there are few examples that focus directly on World War I, as in English, French, and German literatures. However, the war was also dealt with in Turkish written culture after it ended, and the way it was represented emerged in line with various patterns. In this presentation, I will be discussing how this representation emerged, especially during the Armistice and the early Republican period. Gallipoli War takes place in 2 early works that would later become canonical examples of the modern Turkish novel after World War I. The first of these is Yakup Kadri Karaosmanoğlu's Kiralık Konak, The Mansion for Rent, and the latter is Halide Edip Adıvar's Ateşten Gömlek, Shirt of Flame. Kiralık Konak was serialized in İktam newspaper between August the 13th and October the 26th in 1920 and published as a book in 1922. Ateşten Gömlek was serialized again in İktam from June the 14th to August the 11th in 1922 and became a book in 1923. Although both are serialized, They are different from roman feuilleton, that is, serialized novels, which have a special place in the history of newspapers and novels. These texts, which have a heavy ideological load, are the texts that were completed first and then sent to serialization to meet with the audience as soon as possible. The importance of Kiralık Konak stems from this. Yakup Kadri spent the World War I years in a sanatorium in Switzerland for the treatment of his tuberculosis and returned to occupied Istanbul in 1920. Young Yakup Kadri, who was an extremely sharp nationalist, came to terms with his Ottoman past with a Jacobin attitude in this novel and declared that it was over. Kiralık Konak is an anti-conformist manifesto that declares the Ottoman Empire is over. On the other hand, Halide Edip's 1922 Ateşten Gömlek is the founding text of a thematic genre in the Turkish novel titled Independence War Narratives or Novels. It was written and published before the war was completed. At the time of writing the novel, Halide Edip was working in the intelligence unit of the Turkish army. The final and decisive showdown of the Turkish and Greek armies, known as the Başkomutanlık Meydan Savaşı in Turkish, Battle of the Commander-in-Chief, in Turkish history was approaching. Halide Edip prepared this novel as a propaganda text for the nationalist public opinion in Istanbul. The serialization of the novel began with an open letter to Yakup Kadri, where Halide Edip humorously confesses that she stole the title from Yakup Kadri. The author's only apology was the point that the characters of the two authors wearing shirts of flames will be different even though they start from the same source. If this title was the first thing Yakup Kadri thought of for his 1932 Yaban, the Savage, then Halide Edip must be right. The attitudes of the two writers towards the national struggle are very different from each other. We can discuss the different attitudes of Yakup Kadri and Halide Edip towards the national struggle and therefore nationalism, especially through their reminiscence and representation of Gallipoli War. Let's start with Edip. In the text in which Edip presents the first example of the independence war narratives, she constructs a national struggle narrative that contradicts almost all other examples of the genre. Halide Edip, a liberal nationalist, describes the national struggle as a period of revolution and civil war. The heroes of Ateşten Gömlek, to use the author's organicist metaphor, become freedom fighters who sacrifice themselves in a slow but inevitable transformation, just as a maggot turns into a cocoon and a cocoon into a butterfly. However, most Turkish independence war narratives would stay away from the civil war narrative, taking the Nutuk, the speech of Mustafa Kemal, which was published as a book in 1928, as a model, and the national struggle as the struggle of the Turkish nation against internal and external enemies, positioned behind the leader Mustafa Kemal. They would turn it into an epic narrative. However, Halide Edip's handling of Gallipoli is also compatible with the epic and melodramatic approach of the examples that followed her novel. The officer protagonists, Cemal and İhsan, and the foreign affairs clerk, Peyami, the narrator, are watching the enemy ships enter the port of Istanbul. They talk about the wars where 10,000 Turks died every hour in Gallipoli, so that these ships would not enter the Bosphorus, but they still entered. However, an Anatolian soldier in a tattered uniform intervenes and states that the real success would have been breaking through that defense and entering, that doing it now is worthless. Thereupon, the officers embrace the soldier. Thus, the Gallipoli defense and the unity of those who fought there are emphasized as the igniter and unifier of the future independence war. Indeed, in the literary texts to be produced later, Gallipoli would be considered as the prototype and the preparer of the independence war. However, the representation of Gallipoli in Yakup Kadri's novel Kiralık Konak is different. The protagonist of the novel, Hakkı Celis, is a reserve officer who has become a full-fledged Turkish nationalist with the outbreak of the war, but he cannot save himself from the love he feels for his corrupt cousin Semiha. During the novel, Semiha, who turns from a spoiled and snobby rich daughter to a full-blown courtesan, is also flirting with German and Turkish officers, as well as war profiteers who take advantage of war conditions. Unable to rid himself of this unrequited love, Hakkı Celis fights almost like attempting suicide during a bayonet attack in Gallipoli and is shot dead. His death does not affect anyone at Semiha's table, especially Semiha. According to Yakup Kadri in 1916, which marked the end of the novel's story time, there was no national public opinion that could appreciate the positive atmosphere of the Gallipoli defense yet. Evidently, although these two examples represent the Gallipoli War in different ways, they both approach the event itself positively. Kiralık Konak deals with the wartime society, which had not yet appreciated the fact that Gallipoli was the moment when the national identity emerged. Ateşten Gömlek, on the other hand, talks about the occupation of Istanbul, where the consciousness about Gallipoli started to emerge after the disaster that took place. But is it natural for these two writers to have different approaches to nationalism and have a common positive view of Gallipoli? Of course, this may be so, but in fact, historical and collective memory does not occur spontaneously. Occurs in interaction with text and messages created with specific intentions. In this direction, the fact that these two texts, which were produced right after World War I, especially remember Gallipoli among all the events related to World War I, depend on the influence a certain source has on them. This source is Gallipoli Special Issue, published by Yeni Mecmua, a new periodical, in May 1918. As I have written on this subject before, this special issue has a function beyond commemorating the Gallipoli defense. The 1917 Russian Revolution did not only offer Enver Pasha and the Turkish army a chance to survive the expected defeat on the Eastern Front against the Tsarist army. At the same time, the great dream of Turanism could come true, and the Turkish soldiers who defeated the weak Armenian resistance against them would reach Baku in 1918. The Gallipoli special issue of Yeni Mecmua was also based on the thesis that the collapse of Tsarism and the realization of the Turanist dream were possible with the Gallipoli defense in 1915. Of course, the defeat and armistice that came at the end of 1918 would lead to the shattering of this dream. However, the special issue would have a special place in the memories of Turkish intellectuals regarding Gallipoli. Beginning with Yakup Kadri and Halide Edip, many Turkish writers would remember and describe Gallipoli as the prototype of the national struggle, regardless of the Turanism emphasis this special issue was trying to make. At this point, we need to cite a landmark text in the post-Mudros handling of World War I. Although this text did not manage to be included in the canon like Kiralık Konak and Ateşten Gömlek, it can be said that it was decisive in the remembrance and representation of the war. The text in question is the novel İstanbul'un İç Yüzü, The Real Face of Istanbul, written by Refik Halit Karay between September the 15th and December the 15th, 1918, and serialized in Zaman, Time newspaper, between October the 7th and December the 24th, 1918. These dates are important because Refik Halit started to write and publish this novel 1.5 months before the October the 13th Armistice of Mudros, and completed its writing and publication a month and a half later. Refik Halit's novel is a gallery of portraits based on the wartime stories of certain social types that were seen and determined the public space in both the Abdülhamit II era and the Unionist period. Although the novel is quite entertaining, its main feature is this. While initially only criticizing war profiteers based on the Unionist government's easing of press censorship in 1918, it starts to criticize the government from the second half of the novel. Undoubtedly, this courage stems from the fact that the fearsome Unionist Enver Talat and Cemal Pasha's triumvirate fled the country after the Armistice of Mudros. From the middle of the serialization, Karay takes on a much harsher accusation similar to his non-fiction articles published in the Armistice period. The representation of World War I in Turkish literature was predominantly focused not on the fronts, but on the difficulties experienced by the civilians in the home front. I attribute this situation to two interrelated facts. Firstly, the doors of criticism towards war profiteers were opened in the last year of the war. And secondly, it was especially related to this novel by Refik Halit at the time of transition. Of course, Refik Halit's magnificent resentment against the war rich and the resulting sharp power of expression stemmed from the fact that in 1918, the Ottoman press was allowed to criticize this issue. Refik Halit fulfilled the function of making this criticism active in the literary field and making its reproduction attractive. This attitude of representing war as a profiteering narrative, for which Refik Halit laid the foundations, would find one of its first important expressions in the 1920 novel Gün Batarken, At Sunset by Ercüment Ekrem, another humor and satire writer of the period. Ercüment Ekrem serialized Gün Batarken in the newspaper İleri between May the 31st and June the 21st in 1920, and it was published as a book the same year. The book was published a second time in 1922 and a third time in 1926. The first edition in Latin letters also took place in 1939. In terms of the Ottoman Turkish press, this was a very important success. In this novel, Ercüment Ekrem tells the story of an officer from Istanbul named Hulki, who was a unionist but was exiled to the Nevşehir military branch for criticizing the CUP. By following Prodromos, a Greek youth from Nevşehir, Hulki gets involved with corruption and becomes a war rich. During this enrichment, Hulki leaves his family in Fatih, the traditional Muslim district in Istanbul, and begins to live with a Greek woman named Izmaru in Beyoğlu. But Hulki's war wealth and his national feelings start to conflict, causing a pang of conscience. Just at this moment, the war ends, and on the evening of the day of the armistice, we witness Hulki's return to his mother's house in Fatih from Beyoğlu, which is armed with Greek flags. The novel narrates the corruption caused by the war government and the people affected by it, especially the troubles of the Turks from a nationalistic perspective. In this respect, he almost answers the anti-unionist Refik Halit and declares that Turkish nationalism does not have to be intertwined with unionism. Starting from this novel by Ercüment Ekrem, the basic representational template of World War I during the armistice and the early Republican periods was established. According to this pattern, the Unionists set out with good intentions, but deviated from the right path under the conditions of war, leading to the emergence of parasitic war profiteers, and they themselves were immersed in corruption. The Turkish nation suffered directly from this situation, and at the end of the war, they faced both political collapse and economic disaster. We can claim that the basic representational pattern of World War I in the field of literature was in this direction. The anti-war literature of the interwar period, which is seen in European literatures, based on frontline experience, originating from authors such as German Erich Maria Remarque or American Ernest Hemingway, who were in combat or on the war fronts, is not seen in Turkish. In the interwar period and after the independence war, which was in a much smaller in scale, was discussed, not World War I. Topics related to World War I were used to the extent required by the independence war narratives and with rhetorical objectives. If Sarıkamış battle is mentioned, the inadequacy of the Unionist leadership was indicated in these novels. If the Syrian front is mentioned, it is the Arabs stabbing us in the back. And if Gallipoli is mentioned, it depicts the prototype of the national struggle and the leader Atatürk's first appearance in national history. In the home front novels that I mentioned above, the main purpose was to judge and condemn the Union and Progress period as the direct ancien regime of the new republic. This is the underlying political agenda. However, we cannot deny the existence of a tremendous transfer of experience regarding the situation of civilians in war in these novels. From this point of view, the novels considered here should receive more critical attention. The novels in which World War I is handled during the Armistice and early Republican periods are an important source for understanding how the war continues in the historical and collective memory. Thank you for your patience.